Hi, hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker, and today I am doing another fan request show. But it's this is a very exciting show. So came a fan of mine, Annette Cloutier, and that is not how you pronounce her last name, but I forget how I'm supposed to say it. So I'm sorry for my Canadian accent there. But she put me in touch with the famous biblical scholar, or infamous, depending if you're a traditional Christian in that, Dr. James Tabor. And he's recently been interested in the Shroud of Turin. And so Annette put me in touch to ask him on to be on my show and that sort of thing. And we've kind of been going back and forth by email. And I just want to say I respect that Dr. James Tabor seems to be sincerely interested. He's been watching some of my Shroud Wars episodes. I've been asking to get in touch with people, including skeptics like Hugh Ferry, and asking me about my view on the pro Shroud side and certain sources and stuff like that. So I respect that he seems to be taking the subject seriously and doing some research on his end to figure out what he thinks is true and what's true there and stuff like that. So, as a gesture out of respect for Dr. James Tabor taking the subject matter seriously, and because Annette also requested that I do a show, and I've let James know I'll be sending him a link to this show so he can review it, and he knows he has an open invitation. Maybe I could bring him on with some of my friends, Gary Habermas or Ben Witherington, Daryl Bog. I know these guys are all pro Shroud experts, or possibly even Craig Evans. I'd have to ask Gary for his contact. Yeah, and have a discussion on the Shroud of Turin and stuff. But right now, James says he's a bit busy, and that's why he couldn't commit to coming on the show. But he does have an open invite, so who knows what the future has in store. But that said, I did want to respectfully respond to some of what he has to say about the Shroud of Turin. He is a Shroud skeptic, but just a bit of background. So James Tabor is a skeptical biblical scholar. He teaches at the same university as Dr. Bart Ehrman, and he's famous for his claims about the Talpiot tomb, to have, the famous documentary, the Easter special going back to 2004 by James Cameron, Hollywood director of the Titanic there. Right? He claims to have found the family tomb of Jesus Christ himself at the eastern Talpiot tomb, just outside of Jerusalem. And just to give you guys a bit of background on that Talpiot tomb, I'm just going to play a couple quick clips. So this is a quick clip from the Lost Tomb documentary. This is the pro James Tabor side, arguing these are the ossuaries of Jesus and his family.
And so the discovery of inscriptions on stone coffins like these provide archaeologists with a catalog of names specific to the time of Jesus. And on one of the ossuaries discovered in the Talpiot tomb, written in Aramaic, was an astonishing name: Yeshua Bar Yosef.
Yeshua, or Jesus, son of Joseph. Yeshua Bar Yosef. Now, when this was found, I think the archaeologists weren't too excited about it. The public would have been very excited, but they didn't hear about it. You found a Jesus, son of Joseph ossuary? But it wasn't really talked about.
And tons of Christian biblical scholars and archaeologists are skeptical of this. The majority of scholars reject James Tabor's claims about the Talpiot tomb, including my own personal friend, Dr. Gary Habermas, who's written this excellent refutation of the Lost Tomb documentary. He's got Dr. Ben Witherington quotes here, goes over it in exquisite detail on his GaryHabermas.com website, and I'll include that in my slides on my blog for you guys. But I just want to play a couple of clips from some of the scholars, including James Tabor's own partner who helped discover the Talpiot tomb, Dr. Shimon Gibson, world famous Israeli archaeologist from in Israel. And he disagrees with the Talpiot tomb, and he says, no, I agree with Joni Taylor, a former skeptical archaeologist, that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is provably Jesus's real empty tomb. The Talpiot tomb has nothing to do with Jesus or the family of Jesus. And let me just play some of the scholars who represent the majority of secular archaeology who disagree with James Tabor on this Talpiot tomb claim.
We decided to look into the claims of the Lost Tomb film and interview many of the same experts. Dr. James Tabor believes the Talpiot tomb could be the tomb of Jesus of Nazareth.
I would argue that it's likely, from possibly to likely. Of course, one thing, obviously, it has an ossuary with Jesus, son of Joseph, or we wouldn't even be discussing. So the real question is, what Jesus, and can we associate other things in the tomb with this particular cluster of names?
However, Dr. Craig Evans is one of the many who strongly oppose the theory of the Lost Tomb of Jesus film.
Not based on theology or religious convictions, but based on serious, hard-headed scholarship, I conclude that it is highly improbable that the East Talpiot tomb was the tomb of Jesus and his family.
Stephen Cox is familiar with the scientific techniques that were used. He feels that the integrity of the scientific world has been compromised in order to promote this far-fetched notion.
Well, there is not enough evidence to make any kind of assumption that this bone box contained the bones of a man named Jesus of Nazareth. What facts do we know? Well, we've got a stone box. It's of a period of time. We've got an inscription on here that says Jesus, Bar Yosef. And then there's questions with that. Can we even say that the bones that were recovered from this box is the person that was originally put into this box? No.
The Talpiot tomb was discovered in 1980. Shimon Gibson was a young archaeologist who was sent to help excavate and document this tomb when he noticed the strange symbols above the door.
When I first approached the tomb, I noticed these decorations above the entrance. Now, you've got to remember that I was a young student of archaeology at that time, just barely sort of out of my teens. And so it was all new and very interesting and very mysterious at the time.
Shimon Gibson explains that although he was mystified by the Talpiot tomb's facade when he first saw it in his youth, since then he has noticed many other tombs with a similar motif.
You have a kind of sort of repetition of certain motifs. One of them is the gable. So you have this kind of chevron. Sometimes they have, and if you look at the one from the Talpiot tomb, its upper part, it doesn't end in a point of the triangle, but actually curves around. And that is because it's supposed to represent sometimes it's a burial urn or some kind of motif which is at the angles of the pediment or the gable.
Taking a closer look at the original sketches of the Talpiot tomb, we discover that its facade is different from the mark that was found at Dominus Flevit. We also learn that this motif was a common artistic design in the 1st century.
Okay, so that's who Dr. James Tabor is and his claim to fame with the Talpiot tomb, probably his most famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, finding there. But look, he's got other findings as well. And he's come out as a biblical scholar right now and a shroud skeptic, making recent videos cutting up the Shroud of Turin and saying that, in his opinion, it's just a 14th century medieval artistically created religious relic. He doesn't want to call it a fake or fraud because he doesn't want to speak to the artist's motivations, but it's just a 14th century medieval relic. It has no connection to the historical Jesus in the year 30 AD. And like I said, he's recently done a few videos as well as blogs refuting, from his perspective, the Shroud of Turin and the evidence suggesting that it is historically authentic as well as miraculously authentic. I'm going to have a 2-part series here where I want to call James Tabor, the Shroud of the Tomb versus the Shroud of Turin. And this is part 1, where we're going to be looking at the historical, James Tabor's claims about the historical authenticity or lack thereof of the Shroud of Turin, first compared to his Shroud of the Tomb discovery that he made, whereby he says it's the only 1st century burial shroud in existence. The Shroud of Turin is just 14th century. In part 2, next time, I'm going to be covering the scientific or miraculous authenticity of the Shroud of Turin. Is it true that it's a supernatural proof for the resurrection of Jesus? Or as James Tabor goes, he goes for an ordinary natural artistic mechanism. At first, he went for the shadow hypothesis by Gary Habermas's student, Nathan Wilson. But now he seems to most recently have changed to Nicholas Allen and the proto-photo hypothesis. So I'm going to be looking at that in part 2. In this episode, I just want to look at his claims about the historical authenticity of the shroud. And again, James Tabor is an expert in first century Judea and Jerusalem. And specifically, he's discovered and excavated various tombs. So he's someone we need to take seriously and respect his opinion and give substantive rebuttals to. Okay, so James Tabor basically gives 3 main objections to the Shroud of Turin in total. So the first is that the Shroud Man was crucified through the wrists and the middle of the feet. And this is inconsistent with the archaeological discoveries showing first century crucifixion victims were nailed through the palms of the hands and through the heels. Secondly, James Tabor says the shroud cloth is inconsistent with the only provable first century burial shroud through the Akeldama tomb. And in that, James Tabor was one of the ones who excavated that with Dr. Shimon Gibson. And they found a burial shroud dating to the first century. They say it's nothing like the Shroud of Turin. They're night and day. They're totally different. Therefore, the Shroud of Turin is not a first century Jewish burial cloth. And the third claim, again, we'll look at this in part 2, but that's where he says the Shroud Man images have been reproduced using the medieval artistic techniques such as Nathan Wilson's shadow techniques, and or most recently, he's really impressed with Nicholas Allen's proto-photo hypothesis. So that'll be in part 2. Okay, so let's look at the crucifixion and the shroud, his first claim. Once again, James Tabor claims that the Shroud Man depicts the nails piercing the man in places that are inconsistent with the archaeological findings or discoveries we've made representing real first century Roman crucifixion of Jewish victims. So let me just play the clips of what James has to say in his own words, first and foremost.
First and foremost, our best evidence from Jerusalem is from a tomb discovered in 1968 north of the Old City off of Nablus Road, and it contained the skeletal remains of a crucified victim. His name was Yehochanan, unknown otherwise to us in terms of who he might have been. It's a fairly common name. But in his foot bone, which would be here, through the heel, this is a model. This is what was actually discovered and saved. And here's the actual thing. These are models. And lo and behold, it turns out that a crucifixion nail, and here's an example of what one of them looked like, was put through the heel, not through the front of the foot. And we know now that this is not correct. The nails were not in the wrists. For years in teaching courses about the historical Jesus and dealing with archaeology, I would teach the students, I knew about this and the heel bone, but I didn't know about the hands, and now we know about the hands as well. And I was of the impression, and I'd been taught in graduate school, that the nails of the arms were put through the wrists between the radius and ulna bones because that could hold the weight of the body. And it turns out, in fact, that that's not correct, as I'll show you in a minute. But why the heel bone? Because there's no blood vessels. And if you put any nail through the feet, you would have just massive bleeding. The person would pass out very quickly from blood loss. This is probably the way it was done. It makes more sense. Almost like writing stirrups of nails, which is really a rough idea to even think about. But as far as the hands, the arms were tied, we think now, to carry the weight, and the ropes might have been more up here. This drawing might not be exactly accurate. And then the hands were on the back like this, but they were tacked with these small nails. This is from another crucified victim. He's actually known and identified to us as Antigonus or Matthias, who was the last of the Hashmonean kings. And Mark Antony, after Herod defeated him, had him crucified as well as beheaded. And in his hand bone, this is part of his hand bone, this is his jaw. We took DNA from the jaw, but this is actually part of the hand. You see how the nails are still held into the hand right here. And so this was just to sort of tack the hand so you couldn't move back and forth and your hands would be back over the cross.
Okay, so how do I respond? Well, it looks like James focuses on two aspects. There's the nail gone through the heel, not through the middle of the feet, like is seen on the shroud, apparently. And the nail goes through the palm of the hands, not through the wrists, as has been commonly told by biblical scholars like Dr. Gary Habermas and virtually everybody else, including James Tabor himself. Back when he was in graduate school, he would teach this as well. So what do I say by way of response to these claims? Is the shroud just irreconcilable to the archaeological proof for how ancient Roman crucifixions were of Jewish victims in the first century? Well, first of all, we have to say James is quite correct that archaeologically speaking, we only have one example of a Jewish crucifixion victim, Yohanan. He was discovered in 1968 near Jerusalem, and the nail was found still embedded in the heel bone. This speaks absolutely nothing to do with through the wrists or not, but it was through the heel, not through the middle of the foot. And believe it or not, James doesn't mention this in his video, but there is further support for this nailing through the heel, because there was, in 2017, an archaeological discovery in Roman Britain dating between 130 to 360 AD. So not first century, and he wasn't Jewish, but he was a Roman Briton, from the province of Britannia. And he also had the nail still embedded in his heel after his crucifixion and was buried with that. Now, again, it wasn't of a Jew. It's in Britain, not near Jerusalem. And it's 100 years after Jesus Christ died. So it's not first century either. But still, I do think this is some good supporting evidence showing that there was some level of consistent practices even across provinces within the Roman Empire. And this was a good, valid way to crucify the feet and the legs through the heel. And you can get details on the Smithsonian. So here's the face of the Roman Britannic crucifixion victim found in 2017 in Cambridgeshire. This was on Secrets of the Dead on PBS. They had a full documentary talking about it. There's the nail still through and stuff like that. Once again, nothing to do with the arms or hands. That was helpful. So this seems to be all the evidence that we have does support James Tabor's claim. But then again, we have to remember all the evidence we have are just two victims out of how many countless millions of people over the centuries of the Roman Empire that were crucified and nailed. What about the shroud? What do we know about the shroud? Well, it is true. Some medical experts, such as Dr. Robert Buckland, not Buckling, that should say Buckland, in his article, An Autopsy on the Man of the Shroud, he does say a quote-unquote a definite punctuate defect can be noted. This puncture is consistent with an object having penetrated the structures of the feet, and from the position of the feet, the conclusion would be reasonable that the same object penetrated both feet, so one nail through both feet in the middle of the foot, after the left had been placed over top of the right. The punctures of the feet permit the pathologist to conclude that the victim was in an upright position with his arms extended when the blood flow took place. A crucifixion-type posture would be the most plausible explanation of these findings. And Bob Buckland is the world's expert medical forensic, medical examiner there. And this is what he's saying based on his investigation of the shroud. Now, it's important to note that it's not always 100% clear in terms of the position of the legs and the position of the nail with the feet. Other medical experts have disagreed with Dr. Robert Buckland, such as Dr. Frederick T. Zugaby, who was another just as well qualified expert. And, Teddy Pappas mentions this in her scholarly peer-reviewed paper. So in a medical and clinical case reports journal, her paper, peer-reviewed, titled Beyond Imagination, Evidence of Rigor Mortis and Cadaveric Spasm on the Shroud of Turin. And guess what? Even the ultimate shroud skeptic, Hugh Ferry, who believes the shroud is artistic and not real, not a real crucifixion victim, even he admits, and he often takes advantage of the fact that certain medical experts came to different conclusions regarding the positions of the legs and the feet with respect to the crucifixion. And it's in Hugh Ferry's blog called medievalshroud.com/rigor mortis peer reviewed. That's his response to Teddy Pappas's journal there. But look, I think the truth is best summarized by the official Sturt photographer, Barry Schwartz, who is Jewish, not a biased Christian, didn't believe in the resurrection at all. And he confirmed that from his high-resolution images of the Shroud Man, as well as the work of the other medical forensic researchers, the shroud does not clearly demonstrate where or how the Shroud Man's feet were affixed to the cross. There is ambiguity there. Because of that, James can't pin down to say, well, where was the Shroud Man nailed versus these other archaeological findings and prove there's a contradiction. There's ambiguity there. So yeah, the archaeology does not demonstrably and clearly establish a contradiction and therefore speak against the shroud's authenticity. That said, another point that I want to raise here that I'll raise with respect to the hands as well is we know that, look, there is no one size fits all for Roman crucifixion. We know for a fact from our historical documents, such as Seneca, I believe it's book 20 of his, and others who describe different positions of Roman crucifixion, different ways the Romans would crucify it. There was no one size fits all. I remember the shroud skeptic Allen in my Shroud Wars debate, round 2, I believe it was, where he actually made the audacious argument that, oh, well, all crucifixions, they nailed you through the penis. That's how they did crucifixions. It was through a male's penis in privates. And of course, that's complete rubbish. Only a fool would believe that. But who is he quoting? He's getting this from, whether he knew it or not, he was getting this from Seneca, because that's one of the ways he describes Roman crucifixion. He also describes being crucified upside down and different. Basically, he admits there were different ways to validly crucify people in the ancient Roman Empire. So again, even if the shroud and these archaeological findings do actually provably, clearly, unambiguously contradict, that doesn't mean that the Shroud of Turin is inaccurate with respect to a first century Roman crucifixion of a Jewish victim. You cannot make this universal generalization based on the scanty evidence of 2 crucified victims that we have in all of archaeology. It's just not good. It's an insufficient sample size to logically make that an inference, I would argue. And that's totally separate from the fact that there is some ambiguity with interpreting the shroud evidence and where exactly the position of the legs or the feet were in all cases. Now, one thing James does say here in this clip is that, well, if it was through the middle, it couldn't have been through the middle of the feet, because if it were, there would be blood vessels there and he would bleed to death. And I remember a news story of somebody stabbing through that area and there was a lot of blood. Whereas the heel, there are no blood vessels. So that's why that was the ideal spot. That's why the ancient Romans would always go there to prevent rapid blood loss, because they want you to stay alive a long time and suffer for days. Now, the problem is this has actually been refuted by virtually all medical experts and forensic and anatomical experts who've examined the Shroud Man. They say, no, this wouldn't happen even if it was stabbed through. Dr. Bob Buckland had no problem. Frederick T. Zugby would have no problem. I interviewed at least 5 medical experts and forensic experts on my own Real Seekers Shroud Wars channel playlist. And all of them said, no, that was total nonsense. Because there are various reasons as to why, in Jesus' case in particular, as well as in other cases, we wouldn't expect there to be rapid blood loss. And it depends on a variety of factors. So number one, the nail would plug, depending on the shape of the nail, where it was kind of triangular for ancient Roman crucifixions, some of the nails are of this would plug the hole so that there wouldn't be massive blood loss. There's also the viscosity of the blood. I mean, remember, Jesus was scourged, tortured, thirsty. He was in hypovolemic shock. The blood would be not flowing as it would be in a normal human being. And medical experts and blood experts have attested to that. James Cameron cannot establish or prove that there is a contradiction here. And look, in terms of the different positions of the legs and stuff, well, here's one expert, Joseph M. Gambasia, a 109-page article. I'll include this on my blog for this page. So James Tabor, you can go and look at this yourself, as well as any of the fans. And it's all about the position of the feet on the Shroud of Turin, the history of investigation. And on page 48, I believe, 49, they talk about fluid flow and how different things would influence those differently, right? So here's the semi-triangular thing where they actually do experiments on the feet and show that this is true, that there would not be rapid blood flow. The physics of fluid flow, they get into the viscosity of the fluid, the incline, the width of the channel, the path of least resistance, the morphology of the terrain, etc., so on and so forth, right? So there are various factors post-death, but also even before death, that are determinative for whether or not we would expect Jesus to bleed to death if you nailed him through the center of the things. This is not a foregone conclusion. And here's a smaller medical PhD, MD, medical doctorate, considerations on the feet of the man in the shroud. And this is only 5 pages. This will be on my blog, but they go over the shroud evidence on that and show there's no problem here, as James Tabor alleges. Now, what about the wrist versus the palms? Because this is something that I remember Tony Costa was a believer over, and we always say, like, medieval artists were so ignorant, they always nailed through the palms of the hands. And really, from the research of Dr. Pierre Barbet back in the 1930s with actual corpses and stuff, or body parts in some cases, you would have to be nailed through the space of destot, and that would contract the thumb and stuff like that. Since then, there has been further medical research saying there's actually another area, not that same area that James Tabor learned about, that would do the same thing, hold the weight and not break any bones, as well as contract the thumb. So we're not stuck with that 1930s interpretation from Pierre Barbet. We've got another one as well. But anyways, for this claim, James appeals to an alleged Jewish crucifixion victim with the nail, quote unquote, tacked onto the palm of the hand, because these are shorter nails. They're not the long nails of regular Roman crucifixion. And this was found in the palm, embedded into the palm of a hand, from what James Tabor claims to be the tomb of Antigonus Matthias II. Now, this was the last Hasmonean king, Jewish king, before Herod the Great took over. And it was actually Mark Antony who killed this person. Now, James claims that he was both beheaded and crucified. But this just seems implausible. First of all, it's historically implausible because it contradicts the documents, right? The historical records that we have are mixed. In the first place, we have at least 3 sources that including Plutarch and Josephus, the earliest ones, all say that he was beheaded with no mention of crucifixion. It's only when we get to Cassius Dio, centuries later, that we understand that he was crucified, and guess what? There's no mention of being beheaded there. So there's contradictory, mutually exclusive ways being described here. Even if you want to say, well, maybe they're just assumed or implicit in these texts that both happen. Both happening is very implausible. Romans were efficient at their job. When they were set out to kill you, they would kill you. And look, beheading and crucifixion, the goals of that form of execution are the opposite to each other. You would not do both. It doesn't make sense to do both. And this is the only example where there is both. If it is true what James Tabor is saying. No, Paul was beheaded because he was a Roman citizen. He couldn't be crucified. So that was a nice, quick, honorable way to be killed and executed. Crucifixion is the opposite. It's for criminals, for slaves, for scumbags. It's there to shame you. You're going to be in agony for days, slow, torturous death, excruciating out of the cross, the agony that comes. So I just think it's historically implausible, and it's not explicitly, at the least, consistent with the text that we have. You have to make some ad hoc assumptions that it's actually both and there. Now, unfortunately, we have more problems because mainstream archaeologists and scholars, just like with the Talpiot tomb, reject James Tabor's interpretation. This is not Antigonus Matthias, the last Hasmonean Jewish king. So, for example, Joe Zayas, the former curator of archaeology and anthropology for the IAA, the Israel Antiquities Authority, the authorities of all Jewish archaeological excavations in Israel, they say that this theory is little more than urban myth. Ouch. That is harsh. All of the mainstream PhD scholars agree with pro-Shroud people and disagree with James Tabor on this. They say, quote unquote, since the only beheaded skeleton found in this 1971 tomb that James is appealing to, and at the later re-examination of the previously untouched tomb, belonged to an elderly woman, not a king man, Antigonus. In Joe's view, no other set of remains found there could be associated with King Antigonus II, and it is only due to the efforts of the owner of the building located on the top of the tomb that the myth is still being promoted. He's making up propaganda. He wants to get money. He wants tourists coming. He wants to be famous. But mainstream archaeologists dismiss this claim. And so it's interesting. James Tabor is going for this. Just like he goes, kudos to him for at least having the guts to kind of stand on his own two legs and say, no, I'm going to go against the grain. I'm going to go against the scholarly consensus, and this is what I think is the truth, or this is what I believe. He does that with the Talpiot tomb, and now he's doing this with this Antigonus tomb. But all I will say is that when Joseph Zayas and Eliezer Seekles, the experts, re-examined the remains in these tombs, looking for evidence of Roman crucifixion methods, they found no evidence that nails had penetrated the victim's arms. Moreover, the nail in the foot was not long enough to have penetrated the plaque, both feet, and the cross. So these scholars are confirming the Shroud of Turin is it's one nail through both feet. Secondly, look, with this evidence, very few nails have been, and remember, these are shorter nails. That's why James says, well, they weren't nailed through, but they tacked on. The arms were tied up and then maybe just tacked on with these small little nails. Now, the problem is archaeologically, very few nails have been found inside any ossuaries or tombs with the bones. And in fact, in no other case have nails been found attached to hand bones like this unique finding has. And this particular individual was also fairly clearly beheaded, meaning the executioner had to whack the victim twice to complete the job. This is extremely unusual display of incompetence by a Roman executioner. And it goes against, it's not something they would purposefully have tried to do, as I explained earlier. So it looks like they just screwed up, couldn't kill the guy. So finally they're like, okay, take him down and we'll just behead him and get it over with. We screwed up our job. We're not going to get paid, or we'll get in trouble because this guy's not dying from how we crucified him or how we, pinned him up on this stake or whatever it was. We tacked him up on something. Okay, cool. Let's just get it over and done with. Behead the guy. Okay, good. He's dead. The fact that there's no other known parallel of nails being attached to hand bones, it speaks against this finding, representing the standard way Romans crucified victims. Once again, James Tabor has this common trend of making very universal generalizations when they're not warranted, based on very scanty fragmentary evidence, based on one or two examples of such. And he says, well, this is how they all did it. This is how they were all done. This was the standard. This was the way, official way that all crucifixions had to be done. I'm not sure that that's proven at all, and mainstream archaeologists don't either. Look, from ancient literary sources, we know that a person could suffer crucifixion in several different ways. This is what I argued before. Seneca, for example, recalls seeing victims with their head down to the ground, others who had their private parts impaled, and still others with outstretched arms. There was no one-size-fits-all crucifixion technique in ancient Roman times. Thus, James Tabor is wrong to disqualify the Shroud of Turin based on a single or one or two, in the case of the heel bones, archaeological discoveries. This does not follow logically, nor historically, from the evidence, even if we grant him everything he claims about them. Furthermore, the Greek word, Koine Greek word chair, as Dr. Gary Habermas says, in the Gospels means hand. But in ancient Jewish and the ancient Koine Greek, this can include the wrist. The hand is so big, it also includes the wrist area. So we don't know precisely where the nail entered the Shroud Man's hands or wrists. We only know from the Shroud of Turin or from the Gospels, we only have one exit wound. Okay, so this is very important, and it's a point that skeptics always miss, as well as pro-Shroud people. We don't know, we can't see on the Shroud of Turin the entry wounds of the nail. That's hidden because he's got his hands, the outer part of his arms and hands facing us. And one of his hands, his left hand, is over top of his right. So we can't even see the exit wound on the right hand. We only have one exit wound on the left hand, covering the right one. So this is important because the exit wound is clearly in the lower palm, maybe upper wrist area. And so if the nail were properly angled as it entered, it could have done so in the wrist proper and then been angled upwards or through the lower palm and out through the upper wrist area, or vice versa. Maybe it was higher up in the middle of the palm, an angle, although I think that would be improbable, but maybe somewhere around in the mid-lower part of the palm and then angled downward, and it came out towards the upper wrist area as the exit wound we see on the shroud. So, yeah, again, this is just something we can't tell based on the shroud evidence. We don't have the entry wounds to judge the angles of the nails. I would say, actually, the shroud evidence is consistent with either or historical interpretation. If you want to say, no, he was crucified through the wrist, as most biblical scholars and medical experts to this day affirm, and I've seen the peer-reviewed literature confirming this from dozens upon dozens of medical experts and ancient historians and biblical scholars, then great, the shroud is arguably consistent with that. There's no provable contradiction with that. Even if we assume, let's assume James Tabor is correct and that they crucified through, the entry wound was through the palm of the hand, in and around the center of the hand. That's also consistent with the exit wound we see. Again, maybe the nail was angled downward. And I just want to show a clip of the ultimate shroud skeptic, Hugh Ferry, who actually tries to, again, I think he's wrong. Most experts believe he's wrong. Every medical expert says he's wrong. But just to show that it is plausible that maybe the Shroud Man was nailed through the palm of the hands, the ultimate shroud skeptic, Hugh Ferry, says this is what the evidence shows on the shroud. So I just want to show that.
So yeah, let's talk about the hand wound. That's another thing kind of similar. The argument goes that if it was made by a medieval artist, they would have put the wound in like the palm.
Yeah.
But an actual crucifixion victim would have had a wound further up the arm, because if you put it in the palm, it would rip out and it wouldn't work. So that shows that it has anatomic that if a person made it, they would have required anatomical knowledge beyond what would have been available to someone in the Middle Ages.
Can you see a thing that says, here is a photo of a hand? It's my hand.
Yes.
Yes.
With a red dot in the middle of it, where most
It's a lovely hand.
artists place their nails. Now, I turn the hand over, but then reverse it, flip it horizontally so that it matches the first hand. This is the back of my hand. And I put some dots where my knuckles are, and I put a black dot in the middle of the back of the hand. And now I'm going to put those two hands on top of each other, showing where a nail through the front of the hand would emerge. And you'll be amazed. It's very, very close to the knuckles. Can you see my cursor?
Yeah.
Can you see the
It
angle?
is actually a lot closer than I'd have expected.
Can you see the angle between those two knuckles there? Whereas if you put a dot on the back of the hand, the angle is here. Yeah. And if the dot was anywhere near the wrist, the angle would be really steep up there and back down to there. Do you follow the logic to this?
Yep.
Right. So basically using the knuckles as a reference point.
There we are. So I get a little protractor and measure everything. This is where the angle would be if a nail was punched through the palm of the hand. This is where the nail would be if it was punched through basically the middle of the back of the hand. And this angle here would be where it would be if it was going through the wrist. Happy with that? I knew you'd love it. Here is the shroud.
I love numbers.
There are some knuckles, and there is the angle, 64 degrees. Now, is that more like 45 or 91? Well, it's about halfway. I would say it's about here. So the wound in the back in the shroud is too far forward, assuming that's it, than it would be if it was in the wrist. If it was in the wrist, it would have to be up here somewhere. There we go. There is 64 degrees, which is where the shroud wound actually is. There is 45 degrees, which is where it would be if it was in the wrist. Oh, dear.
There we go.
So in everybody's hands, you can see the bones there of the hand. And in everybody's hand, the blue bone is longer than the yellow bone. Does that make sense to everybody? Have a look at your own hand. Yep. The bone between the wrist and the knuckle is longer than the bone between the top knuckle and the second joint down. Everyone can spot that just by looking at their hands. If we look at the shroud, we find that the blue line is slightly shorter than the yellow line. Oh, dearie me. So we can demonstrate that again, the blue line shows the wound actually in the middle of the hand, not anywhere near the wrists. Those two black dots are the famous space of Barbet and another possible nail site. So once again, when we actually look at the anatomy of these things, and this is going to happen again and again and again, because this is why I drive people mad, because I don't take anybody's word for it. I'll actually get to the anatomy and tear it apart and say, no, the shroud wound is not in the wrist. And as you can see, I think anybody looking at that will go, he does have a point. I must go away and research it further myself.
Okay, so as you can see, even if I grant everything you said, James, Dr. Tabor, Hugh Ferry, the ultimate shroud skeptic, who's no friend of pro-shroud experts, in his delightful glee here trying to refute the pro-shroud talking point that that the Shroud Man is nailed through the wrist, actually proves the opposite, that he's nailed right through the palms of the hands, just like you say archaeology proves is the accurate depiction. So the Shroud Man is correct. I could just go with what Hugh Ferry says here. Now, because we're interested in truth, Hugh Ferry is actually incorrect here, and his results have been refuted by medical experts on my own podcast. I've interviewed people like medical doctors like Dr. Thomas McGovern, Andrew Silverman, Gil Lavoie, and Joseph Bergeron, and there's another one, a fifth one that I'm not remembering his name off the top of my head. But in the show with I want to show a clip of Dr. Gilbert Lavoie, because the simple little tricks actually show it's in the lower hand or the upper wrist is probably where the entry wound, the exit wound is. And again, so that's consistent with it being on the wrist and then angled upwards, and consistent with, maybe the lower palm and then angled downwards. So we can't tell because all we see is the exit wound. But it's also the problem is Hugh Ferry is assuming a flat hand. And as Dr. Gil Lavoie says, well, measuring these things are harder than that, because the left hand is over top of the right one. The fingers are curved downwards, which creates a distortion effect, which makes the fingers look longer than they are. And the palm of the hand is angled upward. The wrist is angled so that is up and over the right hand. He'll explain this, but this interferes with taking measurements. It's not as simplistic as Hugh Ferry is. Again, Hugh's not a medical expert. Just Dr. James Taylor, just so you know, his background, I've always said he's a high school teacher, science teacher. That's not true. He's a middle school science teacher. He doesn't have a PhD in any scientific field. That said, he's incredibly smart and a well-informed, knowledgeable person, generally speaking. So I'm not saying never dismiss what Hugh has to say, but I'm just saying the medical experts have said it's not as simple as Hugh is putting out, because there are certain assumptions as to, well, what caused the image? What was the mechanism? Was it radiation or something else? How would that impact how the Shroud Man appears for us to take measurements on a cloth? And also, what was the position of the body? So let me just play Dr. Gilbert Lavoie talking about how that this assumption that Hugh is using to get that the exit wound is in the middle of the palm of the hand doesn't actually work because of the position the hand is in at the time of image formation. So here is Dr. Gilbert Lavoie, world's expert pro-shroud medical researcher.
His right arm, all kinds of assumptions people made, but the reality of it is both these arms are the same length. And I did a study. I don't have it in my later book, but in my last book, but in an earlier book, I did a study, and it showed we did very careful measurements, and you see here that really what's happened is you study this area very, very well of this. Well, we'll say the right arm here, because it looks like the right arm, his right arm, but it's his left. But you see the fingers actually curl around the hand here, and this wrist is actually, and that means that the wrist is bent up. His wrist is bent upward, slightly bent up. So you lose at least 3 inches, 3 inches of distance between here and here compared to here and there. 3 inches are lost. That gives you the impression it's an optical illusion.
So there you go. And I've asked medical experts on my Shroud Wars show specifically about both of Hugh's claims about the angles and the measurements of the knuckles and stuff like that. And they've said, yeah, these are not reliable measurements, and you can't make any conclusions on the basis of them alone, because there are so many assumptions as to what was the mechanism of image formation, what was the position of the body at the time of image formation, what was the position of the cloth at the time of image formation. So there are certain things. It's not just as straightforward as Hugh Ferry having his flat hand and just measuring straightforwardly like that. So yeah, my conclusion, there is no provable contradiction or problem here, regardless of who's right. If pro-shroud scientists talking about the Shroud Man being entry wound being crucified through the wrists, either the space of Destot or the updated version, which isn't the same, or James Tabor is correct that crucifixion, the entry wound was through the center of the palm of the hands. Either way, the Shroud of Turin is consistent with that. There's no provable contradiction on the basis of one exit wound on an bent, upraised, and curved around fingered hand. Let's move on to the second major objection. And this is the second video. So this is going to be on the shroud as a textile. James Tabor, he found what he calls the Shroud of the Tomb. And this is the Akeldama burial shroud finding that dates to the 1st century. And he says this is totally contradictory to the Shroud of Turin. So this is tomb shroud versus Turin shroud. All right. So as I was saying, James Tabor, he lists several objections on this front. The first of which is that he says the tomb shroud is 2 separate pieces, one for the head and one for the body, totally separately. So it's not like the shroud where it's one piece that includes covering the head and then goes around and covers the backside. And here's where James Tabor gives those objections in his blog, The Only Authentic 1st Century Burial Shroud Ever, discovered in Jerusalem, published April 19th, my birthday. 2017 on jamestabor.com/the only authentic first century burial shroud ever discovered in Jerusalem, where he goes into the details. He also gives his scholarly 6-page paper, which won't be posted on my blog because he says not to circulate this, not for circulation, but you can go to James' web. I'll include the link. So go and download it or look at it for your own views, called the Akeldama Tomb of the Shroud and the Burial of Jesus by James Tabor. Or let's hear him give in his own video, YouTube video, the only authentic first century burial shroud.
We're able from this shroud to tell what a first century burial shroud actually looks like. I got this from our friend Nicholas Allen because he's so good on the art. And this is Jean Colomb, 1400s. And it's a typical burial scene of Jesus from the Middle Ages. Notice that the shroud looks suspiciously like the Shroud of Turin. But this idea that you would have this long cloth and you would lay the body on it and not even move it because that might smear, and then you carefully put it over, and then it stays that way until a year later or whatever. That's just not the way Jewish burial was, and we know now archaeologically. I never thought that this looked like what I would think would be a burial shroud from the first century, but you know, what's the evidence? If you don't have one, then what can you say? So here is Shimon's drawing of essentially what we found. Notice it's just remnants, but by putting together all the remnants, and particularly the headpiece, which was separate. Notice in the Shroud of Turin, the shroud goes over the face, and shroud apologists come up with arguments that, well, there was also a face cloth. It's not a face cloth. It's actually a separate part of Jewish burial where you wrap the head separately in a shroud. That was the best preserved, which is really great because that means we could really study what a headpiece is like. It's not a thin sheet where you'd have an image of a face on it, as people have claimed in terms of the Shroud of Turin or the other shrouds that go with it. And then this doesn't look like much, but it's a double layered cloth of wool and linen, which is interesting. You would have never predicted that. The linen, you expect that's what the primary shroud would be made of, that goes on the face, but the wool that's laid over it, it's a double cloth like this, we didn't expect. And remember, in the Torah, you can't mix linen and wool, but the wool is also a sign of luxury. To have a wool garment is very high status, and then the linen cloth as well. So in some of the articles that are circulating, people are talking about the Masada shroud. This matches the Masada shroud. And I'm open. I mean, I want to learn. Dr. Allen would love to hear about a Masada burial shroud that's been tested and found. I'm not aware of that. And in the main article that was published a couple of years ago on this redating the shroud with these new methods of X-ray, essentially, you look in the source and it says so-and-so provided the Masada sample. And you have to say, from where? I'm not saying they made it up. I don't know. But if they had a Masada sample, where was it tested? How was it looked at? Was it carbon dated? Tell us more about it. The carbon dating for the test that I'm talking about is published. I believe it's in the back of volume 3 of the Israel Exploration Society's volumes on Masada. So it's there, anybody can read it. But there's nothing in there about a burial shroud. Now, ironically, in the Gospel of John, you have the grave clothes and the head clothes, the head thing, folded up separately according to the account in John 20. Well, that's interesting because the Shroud of Turin is a single piece, which is the biggest objection from the New Testament to the Shroud of Turin. And so you have to come up with this idea that you put a face cloth on the body and then wrapped around the big shroud, and the face cloth has to do with this legendary cloth that's supposed to have the face of Jesus. But the problem with the Shroud of Turin is it goes over the whole face, and then where's the face cloth? And it's not a separate piece. And if there is a separate piece, like some have identified a certain Byzantine cloth that supposedly has the face of Jesus on it and that sort of thing, that's never been tested or shown. The other problem is any movement of the body once you've wrapped the shroud around it would smear everything. There would be blood blotches and blood drying, because remember, they're burying it very hastily. And it wouldn't look like that. It would look like that picture that I showed you maybe at the first, where blood is coming up through the shroud all over the place. But it wouldn't, the Shroud of Turin is more of a artistic representation of the sufferings of Jesus.
Okay, so that is what James has to say on this front. Now, what's our response here? So in the first place, James mentions various differences of his tomb shroud versus the Shroud of Turin. Notice that there are two separate pieces, with the body cloth not covering the head in his tomb shroud example, and he claims that's standard for all Jewish burials in the first century. And the rich burial shroud is non-kosher, meaning there's two layers to his tomb shroud. There's linen and wool, which is for rich people, but it's non-kosher. It breaks the Shabbat Naz rules, I believe, of Jews in the first century AD. But listen to this. Look, the fact that James's burial shroud has some differences in and of itself proves nothing. Again, one example, you cannot infer logically a universal generalization about all Jewish burial shrouds on the basis of just one. That's not logical. Especially when we know from historical sources there are issues with that. Look, this is not a logical inference that James is giving here from a single sample. Because, number one, even what we know, this sample is atypical. This patient had leprosy. James goes into great detail, and man, he's a great storyteller and scholar. So I very much appreciate it. Watch the full video. I'm going to link to the full 1 hour video. Apart from the clips I gave, it's fascinating hearing the story he did with Dr. Shimon Gibson, how he made this discovery. So go and watch that. But it's an atypical tomb. Look, it was totally plastered over, unlike all other Jewish burials, because this guy had leprosy. And that's why they didn't come back a year later to take the bones out and put it into an ossuary. So we have absolute proof from Dr. James Tabor that this is an atypical first century Jewish burial. It should not be used as the standard for everybody else. Right there, that at least causes reasonable doubts as to, well, is the shroud itself atypical too? Who knows? What were the circumstances surrounding this leprous person? Did they give him a hasty burial, or did they just, who cares? This guy has got leprosy. Give him a shroud with wool. It's non-kosher. It breaks our rules. Just give it to him anyways. Just get him buried and get him out of here. We don't know. There's no way to tell. There's nothing that says this was typical burial shroud of first century AD Jerusalem. So yeah, that's the first point that I wanted to say. And I was surprised that a famous archaeologist and biblical scholar, Ada Grossi, is going to back me up on this. And I have a quote from her scholarly peer-reviewed paper on that front. But yeah, it's obvious they treated this guy in the Akeldama tomb differently in his burial, just by the fact they plastered him up to keep his contamination, leprosy, or cooties, to make it a little bit funny, all to himself. They didn't want to come back and get infected by him. And look, Jewish sources reflecting first century practices explain that there are different burial practices depending on the circumstances. For example, whether somebody was buried in a violent death. Okay, did you wash him or not? And stuff like that. And how much blood there was, for example, affected how you would treat the body for burial. So there are Jewish, and I go into those in detail I'm going to play a clip from Russ Brault on that. But Mark Neer, in my Shroud Wars panel review, I think it was part 6. I'm not 100% certain on that. Mark Neer wrote an entire book on these ancient Jewish burial practices. And he makes this point that there are, according to the Talmud and rabbinic and first century Mishnah sources, there was no one size fits all for all Jewish burials. So again, James Tabor is making this illogical one size fits all assumption that's not warranted. Also, look, even if we grant James Tabor, let's grant that this was typical of the first century Jewish burial shroud. Let's just give that to him for the sake of argument. There's no logical link to Jesus's shroud, right? Because he can't prove, well, was Jesus's shroud meant to be a typical Jewish burial? No, there's nothing that says that. In fact, we know it's the opposite. The Bible tells us they buried him in haste. He had a violent death, so he's not typical there. And we know that the burial was incomplete due to the haste. They had to stop, and that's why the women were coming back on Sunday to complete the ritualistic burials, perhaps complete the washing and that sort of thing. And they were bringing spices with them. So Jesus's burial is atypical of the standard Jewish practice. So the Akeldama tomb shroud is totally irrelevant, right? Because maybe there was an atypical Jewish burial, which included an atypical shroud. So therefore, the Shroud of Turin can be ruled back in. There's nothing that disqualifies it or proves that it's not a first century or was not used as a first century Jewish burial shroud in Jesus Christ's case. Finally, again, let's say James is correct and his tomb shroud is the only provable first century burial shroud. Again, this doesn't prove that the Shroud of Turin wasn't. Maybe the Shroud of Turin is not a burial shroud. Maybe James is right. This is the shocking thing. But it's another cloth, and this is a suggestion from Dr. Grossi, that should say, who argues it was a discarded temple cloth, a specific cloth used in the temple, but because there was a fault in it, it was discarded, and that's how Joseph of Arimathea was able to purchase it. And in his haste to get Jesus buried before the sun, we're just going to use this cloth instead of a proper burial shroud. Nothing disproves that in Jesus' case. Hence, the Shroud of Turin fits. Dr. Grossi says that the Shroud of Turin fits one of these ancient temple cloths. And I'll read the quote from her later on in her scholarly paper on that front. Others have said maybe it's a buyer cloth. In their haste, again, we've got to get Jesus buried. So, grab that cloth. Let's just use this. This is the best we've got. I don't have time to get a proper burial shroud. Let's just use this. Get him in the tomb. Get him prepped before sundown. Okay, put him in it. We'll come back on Sunday and finish the rest later. Look, we know Jewish sources. I've done this. I think it's in my show with Wipo, the Bible skeptic, on the Shroud of Turin, where I quote extensively from archaeological sources and Jewish sources dating from the first century and beyond, speaking about exceptions to the burial shrouds that were used. And in fact, due to time factors or other circumstances, certain exceptions were allowed in terms of the cloth or what a person was buried in. In fact, most burial shrouds we have, this will speak to the Masada thing, are actually clothes or tunics. Ordinary poor people, were buried in their clothes, in their tunics. Archaeological proof of that. And that's why some of the Masada things are actually burial shrouds, because they were buried in their clothes. Now, just to go over some of the scholarly sources, James, and I notice this all the time, James Tabor, as well as other shroud skeptics, they always love to cite this admittedly scholarly, important paper by Orit Shamir, a shroud skeptic. But they only cite that because he gives them the opinions that they like to hear, quite frankly. But it's important to note, I've done actual scholarly research on all archaeologists that have written about this, not just the one scholar who fits and tells me what I want to hear by Orit Shamir. I've read Orit's paper as well, because he needs to be read. And in fact, I'm going to show you his paper linked for free on my blog. But most of the experts disagree with them. And I've provided links to papers by people who are pro-shroud archaeologists and textile experts, such as Dr. Methchild Fleury-Limburg. We'll talk about her when we get to Masada. And most importantly, she's neutral on the shroud. She's not pro-shroud, but Dr. Ada Grossi. So let me just show, first of all, my blog, and then I'll show a clip talking about the fact that the shroud may not be a burial shroud. Maybe James Tabor is right, and it's actually a cloth that was used in the Second Temple, but was defective in some way, such as having the side, what we know as the side strip on it. It wasn't cut to the proper length, and they had to sew on a side strip to it, and therefore it wasn't perfect, so it was discarded for use in the temple, and then that's how Joseph of Arimathea got a hold of it. So let me take a look at the sources here. All right, so as you can see, so here's the paper by Orit Shamir. This is the one that cotton textiles from the Byzantine period to the medieval period in ancient Palestine. So this is the one that people like James Tabor like to quote. This is the scholar, but I include other scholars who are neutral and or pro-shroud. So I have Donna Campbell, John Tyre. He's a pro-shroud guy. He argues and proves that the shroud cannot be a medieval shroud. It just doesn't fit based on the textile evidence. And here's the shroud neutral, Ada Grossi, in her paper called Jewish Shrouds and Funerary Customs, a comparison with the Shroud of Turin. I'll just maximize that for you guys. So yeah, the cloth, Sha'at Naz, the absence of Sha'at Naz. The Shroud of Turin is kosher. The tomb shroud's not. In this paper, here's a quote from Ada Grossi on page 21. She says, as for archaeological evidences, we refer to the huge work published in 2005 by Rachel Hachele Lili. The bodies were wrapped in shrouds made of wool or flax, or as an alternative in reed or palm mats. And then here's the part of great interest. So look, it's not true that these are the only burial shrouds we have. We have multiple archaeologically proven burial shrouds here. And they're all confirming in different sorts. They're not all one size fits all, consistent with the tomb shroud of James Tabor. So Ada Grossi says, quote unquote, of great interest are also the finds of Khirbet Khazoni in Jordan, for instance, a burial shroud made of wool dating back to the 2nd century BC, and those of En-Gedi, 2nd century BC as well, where the archaeologists identified a few textiles made of flax with burial shrouds. In many cases, these are kind of Greek cloaks or Roman sleeveless tunics being used as burial shrouds here, or common clothes, or again, parts of garments reused to wrap corpses. The Akeldama shroud cannot be considered as typical of 1st century AD customs. In the first place, because, and the Akeldama shroud, that's the shroud that James Tabor is talking about. That's the one he found. So they're saying this is not typical of 1st century AD customs. In the first place, because the loculus, or a niche where the shroud was, had been unusually sealed with white plaster. The man died from leprosy and tuberculosis. That's just what I said. Moreover, Ada Grossi goes on, archaeological data have to be interpreted with due caution, at least on the grounds that the finds we know are just a minor part of what is still waiting to be dug in the Middle Eastern area. That's another point that I made. Thank you, Dr. Ada Grossi, worldwide expert in the archaeology area, just like James Tabor, confirming I'm right and James is wrong on this. What about the temple? What could it be that it was used for the temple? Well, here's on page 23. Here's a picture of it being used as the satin shell buzz cloth with the priests in the temple here. And she says, let us now focus on the interesting Regato proposes in relation to the Greek term syndon athonia in the Gospels. That's how they refer to it. A close examination in Greek literature The close examination in Greek literature leads her to conclude that such a term is related to linen fabrics of different kind and value, such as byssus, for instance. She then lingers over the specific Semitic words used in the Bible and in the Mishnah to indicate different varieties of linen. Regato, as we already mentioned, identifies the fabric of Jesus's burial shroud with a special piece of cloth belonging to the Temple of Jerusalem, and suggests that Nicodemus took it from some temple storage room afterwards. So they're talking by the shroud, they're talking about the Shroud of Turin here. It's consistent with a piece of cloth belonging to the Temple of Jerusalem, the second temple, destroyed in 70 AD, and suggests that Nicodemus took it from some temple storage room. Afterwards, Nicodemus attended to Jesus' burial with Joseph of Arimathea and helped him wrap the body. The special fabric Regato mentions is called the Sedin Shel Buz. That would be the one spread between the people and the high priest during the 5 ritual immersions in the Mikvah he had to perform on the morning of Yom Kippur. So that's what the Shroud of Turin is. James is right. It's not a burial shroud, but it was used as a burial shroud, and that was permitted within first century Jewish burial customs, especially given the circumstances relevant to what Jesus Christ and his passion narrative as described in the Gospels. Now, just in terms of this temple plot, I want to play a couple clips from Pro Shroud experts Russ Brault and Bob Rucker, who also confirm what Ada Grossi was saying here.
Given the technology used to manufacture the shroud, well, that's what he's talking about. He's talking about how the shroud was woven and bleached and used these individual hanks of yarn, anyway, so I come away with saying, no, I don't have a slam dunk. Here's a precise example of another shroud, just like the Shroud of Turin. We don't have that. Is because, I think the shroud was pretty special. It's, here's, Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the Sanhedrin. He had access to the temple. He probably purchased this linen from the temple store. He bought linen that was suitable for a high priest about to enter the Holy of Holies. And so this wasn't some ordinary cloth. And so again, another reason why we're probably going to be hard pressed to find another example of it.
And here's Bob Rucker.
The fact is that the presence of this side piece that was stitched back on would defile it and make it, they would not want it in, they would not accept it for the temple. So that may be why it was available for Joseph of Arimathea to purchase.
Let me ask this then, because so if that's the case, then that might raise. I've heard a lot of Christian shroud skeptics, such as you, but they'll raise the Bible, John 20, and it refers to multiple cloths. So aside from the headcloth, the sudarium, what were the multiple cloths then? If it's not referring to this strip, like how do you guys answer that then?
Strips, wrists, chin, ankles, strips of linen. Remember, John 19:40 says that Jesus was buried according to the burial customs of the Jews. But remember, there were 2 different customs, one for normal death and one for violent death with significant loss of blood, in which case there's no removal of the clothes, no washing of the body, and the body is simply wrapped in a single cloth called a sovev, which means to envelop or wrap around. And it's and so from that concept, I mean, the shroud seems to correlate with the Jewish tradition of someone who died by violent death.
So there you have it. And now one thing James argues, but the Shroud of Turin contradicts the burial shroud as explained in the Gospel of John chapter 20. So they can't be the same shroud, because the burial shroud wasn't inconsistent with the shroud he found, the 2 pieces, head and body separate, not one enveloping shroud over top of the corpse. So first, I just want to say the way, if you want to read John in this way, Christians will use it to disprove both your tomb shroud and my shroud. as burial shrouds. Obviously, they're wrong, right? But they'll say, well, John talks about linen strips or cloths, plural. That's what I was asking Russ and Bob and Hugh about in that little clip just now. And they say, oh, he's wrapped up like an Egyptian mummy. That's totally wrong. James, you would agree with me, right? Your thing is not an Egyptian mummy of thin little linen cloth strips. So I think we just need to be careful about making assumptions and not looking at the nuance that John chapter 20 is giving, or the Gospel of John is talking with respect to Jesus' shroud. I think you're misreading it. It's not telling us that, oh, it's multiple cloths, 2 cloths, one for the head and then one for the body at the same time. No, first of all, it's talking about the sudarium of Oviedo, the head cloth, which was put on Jesus separately to carry him from the cross to the tomb. Then that cloth was removed, thrown to the side, and then the shroud was put over top. So he's not wearing the sudarium of Oviedo, the head cloth, underneath the enveloping Shroud of Turin. No, the head cloth's taken off once he's in the tomb and prepped and ready to go, and then the shroud cloth, enveloping shroud cloth, is put over top of him. That's what the pro-shroud position is, just to get that straight. And there's nothing in the Gospel of John that speaks against that having happened. Nothing at all. Just says there was a separate headcloth, and on Resurrection Sunday, it was found in a separate place unto itself, right next to the side of the folded up, enveloping one shroud cloth. And in terms of the other cloths, like those are the binding strips and stuff like that, to bind the enveloping cloth to the corpse. So everything fits here. And I've done shows with biblical scholar Larry Stolley. Ben Witherington III agrees the Shroud of Turin is perfectly consistent. Daryl Bach, stuff like that. So there's nothing in the Gospel of John that contradicts the Shroud of Turin as the accurate first century burial shroud that covered Jesus as described in all 4 of the Gospels. And I've done multiple shows, again, Wipo, the Bible skeptic, on my Shroud Wars. I watched the panel review where I have Mark Antinocci, Hugh Ferry, and the expert in ancient Jewish burials, Mark Neer, discussing this. As well, I've done various shows with Larry Stolley from a biblical scholarly perspective, and he addresses in my show with S.J. Thomason and Larry Stolley. I ask him about this objection from the Gospel of John, and he gives his scholarly answer on that front. So yeah, nothing contradicts, and the Gospel of John is perfectly consistent with the Shroud of Turin. Going on, James mentioned something about the blood that I found very interesting and helpful, right? Because he says, well, if the images are due to contact with Jesus's corpse through naturalistic direct contact, the bloodstains would be all smeared or altered, right? And he showed us that picture. Great point. That's why direct contact probably fails, and we need a supernatural resurrection to describe how the bloodstains got on the cloth. Because artistic painting will not explain the shroud images, the shroud's bloodstains. We can actually disprove that. There have been scientific experiments, such as the ones done by Mark Antinocci and Arthur Lind, and I'll link to that paper in my blog post. So James, yeah, if you click on the YouTube video description, click on my blog, and all these sources will be there in PDF format for free, so you can do your research, look into what I'm saying. But yeah, traditional painting cannot explain the bloodstains. It fails to reproduce all the physical and chemical properties of the bloodstains. But direct contact wouldn't explain them either, right? There is that problem with smearing or alteration. So how do we answer that? Okay, so there's 2 answers. So here's the first answer. The first answer is to say you're wrong about this, James. There wouldn't be smearing and alteration. And actually had a blood expert who's a friend of mine. He doesn't like this term, but I describe him as a shroud agnostic. He's neither pro-shroud nor skeptic, but he's a blood expert and an immunologist. And he actually did scientific experiments and published in a peer-reviewed journal his results, proving that actually there is a possible way to transfer dried blood stains in their shape onto a cloth. I'm just going to play a 7-minute clip of him discussing his experiments. This is, again, fully natural, no miracles needed.
Well, thinking about, because again, I think it's a very fair point about, well, blood would have dried. Now, maybe it was liquid through coagulopathy or something like that, but let's just say that it did dry. Well, if you think about the how Jesus was buried, the scriptures say he's buried in a cave tomb environment. And something that caves all over the world have in common is that they're low temperature and they're high humidity. Now, the temperature is going to raise a little bit. The humidity will go down a little bit as you come toward the entrance of a cave. But those are typical features of all caves. And Natowski, I believe it was her that made some measurements at the Cave of the Holy Sepulchres, not known exactly, or Tomb of the Holy Sepulchres, not known exactly where Jesus was buried, but a lot of people believe that may have been the site. But she made some measurements around there, typical of most caves, no surprise. It's around 55 or so degrees Fahrenheit, a high humidity up in the mid-90s. So I wanted to look at this kind of thing and ask, well, if you put bloodstains in a cave tomb environment under those conditions, would the blood become in a liquid state that it was sufficient in order to get transfer? So let me just see if I can go back to this again. Okay, so this is the, excuse me, this is the general system for this. So I added blood to skin. Excuse me, I added blood to skin. I used pig skin for most of this because that's as similar to human skin as you can get. That's what most medical students, they'll learn how to train to do sutures on that. I also did it with mouse skin and got similar results, but most of the experiments in the paper are shown with pig skin. So I put blood on there and allowed it to dry for about 4 to 5 hours. And just to make sure it was dried, I took a piece of filter paper or linen, pressed it, laid it on that blood stain, and showed that no blood would transfer over. And then if that was good, I then took a fresh piece of linen or filter paper that's shown on the right. I overlaid that onto the skin with the blood stain, and then I sealed the edges I didn't want any moisture to run into the side and kind of interfere with being wetted that way. So I put this in a humidity chamber, and I could control the humidity and the temperature. So here's an experiment. This is done on linen. So I let this go like overnight, around 12 hours. And here's the contact side. You can see in low humidity, it doesn't transfer. In high humidity, it did. And this is the reverse side of that cloth. So similar to many shroud bloodstains, it also soaks all the way through. Here's one with both cotton and linen. So here's the original blood stain, and this is that control just to show that it doesn't transfer. And this is the blood imprint. So if you look at, let's say right here, there's a little bump. You can see that's imprinted over. There's a couple of kind of rays coming off of this one. You can see that goes over. So it pretty faithfully reproduces the original blood stain. So here I've kind of tried to model this epsilon wound on the forehead. So this is the original on the skin, and this is the control to show that it was dry going in. And this is the blood imprint that you see. I used electrical tape to put these down on the chamber, and I really kind of had to pull pretty hard on these to get them off sometimes. So some of the linen was halved or even doubled again in 4. So I think that's kind of why you might see some of this cracking here. But you can see that it's a pretty faithful reproduction of what you started with. And the edges here are, I think, relatively smooth. And if you look at this one, I chose this particular blood stain on the arm because this is one that Rucker said would have been dried, and it dried in that position because of the position of the arms on the cross. So this is the imprint that I see. So I think here the edges, a lot of the word pristine is used a lot when describing these. I think here the edges are quite pristine, to use the word. I think Barbet might have been the person that first kind of coined that phrase of these imprints. The Dr. Barbet's grandson actually contacted me, and his grandson, of course, heard a lot about the shroud from his grandfather, and he liked this so much that he asked if he could translate it into French so that he could post it. And that was a very humbling endorsement, because I've referred to that, Doctor of Calvary referred to that book a lot during the years. But I think the edges here are quite clean with this. And here's the blood stain that's present on the wrists. So you have under UV, you can see that serum halo that's there. So here I've tried to kind of reproduce that. Here's the original blood stain, and this is the serum. You can't see it that well under the visible light, but this is the resulting imprint that you see. So you can see there's really not a smearing that has occurred here, and the serum and the blood, they really don't kind of mingle and mash together. You get pretty discrete borders.
All right, so that is Dr. Kelly Kearse, worldwide immunologist and blood expert, talking about how maybe direct contact isn't as natural. Direct contact can explain the blood stains. Again, I disagree with him. I agree with you, James Tabor. I agree with James Tabor that no, it requires a supernatural action. But what about the artistic? James says that, oh, Nicholas Allen has proven that it can be the bloodstains can be replicated artistically with a paintbrush. That's been scientifically disproven as well. Now, I'm going to include this on my blog, but by physicist Dr. Arthur Lind and Mark Antigonus, hypothesis that explains the shroud's unique blood marks in several critical events in the Gospels. They did in part 2 of the paper, they do actual scientific experimental research, testing direct contact and painting or traditional artistic ways, creating the blood stains. And my goodness, they absolutely prove that it does not reproduce the Shroud of Turin's blood stains, actually, as well as all of their physical and chemical features. They fail to produce one or more of those features. But once again, there's some of the results. I will link to this paper in the blog. So James, if you want to check it out, you can get that for free. Otherwise, I will get into this in more specificity and detail in my part 2 to this episode, where I look at Nicholas Allen's proto-photo hypothesis to explain both the body images and the bloodstains. And I'll get more specific as to why artistic mechanisms cannot replicate the bloodstains. That's a failure. Therefore, we're only left with supernatural mechanisms to explain the shroud's bloodstains on the cloth. Okay, so if it is supernaturally explained, the shroud's bloodstains and their unique properties, what are some examples of that? Well, I provide 2 here. So the first is from Mark Antigonus and physicist Dr. Arthur Lind, in what's called their historically consistent hypothesis. They basically, Star Trek in the transporter beaming technology, basically they think both the body and the blood disappeared, beamed away, and the bloodstains were beamed or transported onto the cloth first, then the body images were encoded onto the cloth after the bloodstains beamed from the body to the cloth. I call that the transporting. This is phase 2 of the historically consistent hypothesis. Or alternatively, the more hypothesis I more lean towards myself now is Bob Rucker's vertically collimated radiation burst hypothesis, where he includes the blood being thrust off the body through the force of what's taking place with the proton and neutron irradiation event, where the body enters a new dimension. And during this vertically collimated radiation burst, this force thrusts the bloodstains in dry or liquid form straight onto the cloth in situ, as it was on the body, without smearing or any alteration or anything like that. So let's take a look at them explain this in their own words.
What about the blood, the encoding of the blood stains? What does your theory postulate on that front?
Well, this is the weakest point of my theory, and it's independent of the body image formation. But I hypothesize, I sure as heck haven't proved it, but I hypothesize if the body can give off neutrons and disappear? Well, the blood is made of the same, chromosomes, DNA, things like that. If the body did that, that might explain a lot of features about the body. If it disappears, the cloth keeps falling, and whereas the body reappears outside the tomb, or certainly outside the shroud, why couldn't the blood reappear where it disappeared at? And as the cloth collapses, it reappears, and that explains the pristine quality of the blood marks and how they're embedded. It would also be consistent with the fact that blood is on the shroud, but obviously no body is there. And when Jesus is seen on Easter morning, there's no blood on his face or his head or his hands or his feet, the visible portions that you would have seen on him.
And here's Bob Rucker with his vertically collimated radiation burst hypothesis, explaining briefly the bloodstain part.
And so the summary of the VCRB hypothesis: protons form the images by producing an alternating current that squirts the outer circumference less than 0.2 micrometers thick. Neutron absorption in nitrogen-14 produce new carbon-14 to shift the carbon date forward from the true date. And a possible third item here is that the force of these particles, neutrons and protons, exiting the body may have thrust the blood off the body onto the cloth.
So this is a supernatural alternative. Both Mark Antinocci and Bob Rucker's theories are miraculous, supernatural events at the time of the resurrection. And on that front, it can obviously explain the bloodstains and their properties on the Shroud of Turin easily, because it's a miracle of God. God can do anything. Okay, so that covers the blood aspect of James Tabor's claims. Now, what about Dr. Methchild Fleur-Lemberg, the world's expert in textiles? She is so world-renowned. Just in case James Tabor is not, James, you're not familiar with her. Dr. Methchild Fleur-Lemberg is such a textile expert. She was actually the one textile expert they wanted to get back in 1988 to select the sample for the carbon-14 dating. Now, she was busy that day, so she ultimately couldn't do it. But her reputation was such that the carbon-14 scientists wanted her. So we need to respect her and what she says. And in fact, she was in charge of the 2002 restoration project of the Shroud. She investigated the Shroud of Turin in person to restore it during the 2002 conservation project. And she also worked with another worldwide textile expert, Irene Tomidi, who she's in her 90s now, and I was trying to get her to come on my show. Obviously that's, because just due to the age, that wasn't going to work. But I had the pleasure of at least email conversations with the second in command of this 2002 restoration project, Dr. Irene Tomidi, who was also a world's expert in textiles and says the shroud's authentic. Anyways, it was Dr. Methchild Fleur-Lemberg, during her investigation, she was the one who first noticed that the entire cloth was crafted with a weave known as the 3-to-1 herringbone pattern. Okay, so she didn't first see that, but she says, quote unquote, this kind of weave was special in antiquity, the days of Jesus, because it denoted an extraordinary quality. Less fine linens of the first century would have had a 1-to-1 herringbone pattern. Then Fleur-Lemberg discovered a peculiar stitching pattern on the seam of the long side where that side strip is. And with this strip, they noticed that the stitching pattern itself was the work of a professional and is surprisingly most similar to the hem of a cloth used as a burial shroud found in the tombs of the Jewish fortress of Masada. Okay, so this is where I think the Masada comes from, right? So the Masada cloth dates between 40 and 73 AD. 73 AD being when Titus, the Roman general, finally conquered the Masada fortress and slaughtered all of the Jewish zealots that were holding up in there. Now, the evidence, according to Dr. Fleury-Lemberg, is clear. She says, quote unquote, the linen cloth of the Shroud of Turin does not display any weaving or sewing techniques which would speak against its origin as a high quality product of the textile workers of the 1st century. And she says the stitching pattern is most like that found on the hem of cloths from tombs in the Jewish fortress of Masada. Very interesting. And these date between 40 and 73 AD. James was trying to say, well, actually they don't, they date later, stuff like that. I'm not sure exactly what he was talking about on his end. Obviously, again, he's a world's expert archaeologist, so he's not just talking nonsense, but I just needed a little bit more context because it wasn't clear what he himself was admitting. He wasn't totally sure about what people were claiming about Masada and the burial shroud there. So I think I'm just taking my best guess that when you hear about Masada, people are talking about Dr. Methchild Fleury-Lemberg, who was in a PBS special, Secrets of the Dead. You can find it's publicly available on the internet. Again, I'll include links. Unfortunately, the video is not freely available, though, where she says this quote about the stitching pattern being comparable to cloth found in the tombs of Jewish fortresses of Masada, and they are Jewish, dating between 40 BC and 73 AD. So I think that's what they're talking about. It dates the 1st century because of this stitching pattern, and it's amazingly striking correspondence to the seams of these Masada fortress cloths found in the tombs. I think that's what you were talking about there. But yeah, and I linked to her papers on my blog. All right, next we move on to the carbon-14 dating comparison, because James is quite gleeful, quite happy, as he should be. It's an amazing discovery, but he's quite gleeful that his tomb shroud, it was carbon-14 dated, and it came up with the, according to him, 1st century AD. Although I think as we go through this, we'll see it's actually more 1st century BC, I would say, more so than AD. It covers both time spans, but we'll get more details on that in a bit. But James points out that the Arizona labs, according to Dr. Doug Donahue, who did the testing, the carbon-14 testing here, Doug Donahue, for all my pro shroud beeps, that name must be ringing some bells. The head of the Arizona carbon-14 labs. Wasn't this one of those carbon-14 scientists that carbon dated the Turin shroud? You bet. So Doug Donahue sent James Tabor a letter in which he joked mockingly a little bit of the Shroud of Turin. Now let's just see some video clips. What does James Tabor say about the carbon-14 dating of his tomb shroud versus the Shroud of Turin?
Has Shimon really found a 1st century shroud from the time of Jesus? The only one ever to have been discovered in Jerusalem?
Just a few weeks after the Jerusalem shroud was found, the University of Arizona had the result of the radiocarbon dating tests. So, was it a 1st century shroud?
We treated it more or less as all the other samples. We get sort of 5,000 samples per year run through the laboratory. And we got the result, and I reported it first over the telephone and then by letter. And when I talked to Professor Tabor over the telephone, I detected a certain amount of excitement in his voice when I told him that the cloth was 1st century.
I got this letter by fax first and just simply stared at it, and we were quite ecstatic over these results. And then at the end of his letter, I'll read you what he wrote. Our friends from the Shroud of Turin days would certainly have appreciated a result like that one.
Okay, so let me explain a few things here. But let me tell you something about Donahue that you saw at the University of Arizona. He's the one who did the testing on the Shroud of Turin. So that was his point. He wouldn't just randomly mention the Shroud of Turin. I mean, he might have, but he's saying, wow, years ago I tested a shroud and turned out to be Middle Ages. This is what it's like to test a 1st century piece of cloth. Now, We did not tell him. I shipped the samples. It was all done from Charlotte, North Carolina to him, back to me, and so forth. And it was blind test. He had no idea what it was. I just said, I work in archaeology. We have a cloth sample here. We're trying to date it. We don't know if it's ancient, medieval, modern, what it is. So he had no clue. But once he reported it in that interview, he's remembering, he already knew. He was quite excited too. So we said, well, that's a burial shroud. And he's like, what? It was a fax, and the fax had the date on it. So I just wrote it up here and scanned it, and you can see what I read. Our friends from the Shroud of Turin days would certainly have appreciated a result like that. I'll be interested to know the ramifications of this result. Well, I'm giving you the ramifications now. It is a first century shroud. Now, a very good colleague of mine, he's an anthropologist. I'm not going to name him because I don't want to embarrass him, but he was involved with us at Suba and helping us, and he's a good friend. And he said, James, I can tell you one thing, it's medieval. There's not a chance that that's a first century shroud. And I said, well, we're still going to test it. He said, they reuse these tombs throughout history. There's no way that a first century shroud could be preserved for all that time. Kind of like the Dead Sea Scrolls, except now we're in Jerusalem. So it's even more unlikely. And then he said, if it's first century, I'll eat my hat. And as he was talking to me, he was leaning on his bicycle with his plastic hat on, you know, like a bike helmet. So he was talking about his plastic hat. So obviously I called him when this result came in, and I said, you know, not saying his name right now because it doesn't matter. I need you to see these results because you got some chewing to do. And he just laughed. And of course, he accepts science. Here's the actual report. It's not the detailed report, but this is what you get when you do a DNA test. You get basically a summary. So Doug Donahue and T. Lang did it, Department of Physics, University of Arizona. It's one of the great testing labs in the world at Tucson at the University of Arizona. And this is what they found. This is the technical stuff. Then you got your sigmas, which are your probabilities. It's all explained here. Late second century, early first century, but we say first century because it does go into the first century. And that's where this date also works out. And that's what his letters said.
So I just want to point something out here. Like, it looks like, so the 2 sigma is the international standard, right? That's the 95% degree of confidence. So it looks like 170 BC to 24 AD is the range. And it's within 1 sigma, it's 113 BC to 1 AD. So I would say this is more, again, I don't know how to read these statistics, but it sounded like James just said, we're just assuming it's first century AD. Why wouldn't you assume it's first century BC? Because that seems more probable. There's more dates. It seems more heavily loaded on that end than it does to be, you know, from the first century AD. And look, none of the dates you got date to the time of Jesus in 30 AD. So it's the latest. It's 24 AD. You know, that's too early, I guess. Maybe practices changed totally in the year 25 AD. Okay, I'm getting a bit ad hoc and ridiculous there, but still, like, the main point with this carbon dating, this doesn't look as good as James is making it seem. It looks like we got a first century BC burial shroud, if anything, not a first century AD one. At least that's the more likely option, I would say, based on my best understanding of these carbon-14 results. But let's get into our evaluation. Okay, so in the first place, James is quite gleeful about this carbon-14 date of the tomb shroud, and it is a remarkable discovery, so it's understandable. There's that problem that it looks like it's more likely a first century BC, not first century AD cloth, according to my understanding at least. Also, there is this issue because Doug Donahue, supposedly this was a blind test. So why is he making jokes about the Shroud of Turin? How is he understanding that just because he got this random cloth and it dates to the 1st century, that it's comparable to the Shroud of Turin? It looks like maybe it wasn't blind. Maybe he was told this is a shroud and it's potentially 1st century. So that's why he's kind of showing off and mocking the Shroud of Turin people, pro-shroud guys. Now, unfortunately, when it comes to the carbon-14 dating of the shroud has not been proven to be medieval from the carbon dating. Tristan Casabianca sued the British Museum in 2017 and forced them to release the raw data. And once that was released, they found out that they fudged the data back in 1989 using the chi-square test. And actually, there was a 98.6% probability of a systematic bias affecting the results, thus giving us inaccurate carbon-14 dates that don't accurately reflect the actual calendar age of the cloth. So the question comes up, what would these systematic biases be? And one of the options was suggested in the same 1989 journal, Nature Journal paper, Neutron Irradiation by Dr. Thomas Phillips, from carbon-14 scientist from Harvard University. And Bob Rucker took up on this, as did others, and he has actually done precise calculations with the MCMP Monte Carlo neutron particle US government software, the world's top software in the world when it comes to this thing. And he's calculated a model and used that to create his vertically collimated radiation burst hypothesis based on neutron irradiation for getting a 30 AD cloth to give a 14th century date, carbon-14 date, erroneously. And you can see details on that in my Shroud Wars panel review show, part 1, on the carbon-14 with Hugh Ferry, myself, and Bob Rucker. Or I did another show where he presents PowerPoint presentations, including the carbon-14, on Real Seekers, S.J. Thomason, and nuclear engineer Bob Rucker, the shroud images as a burst of radiation. So you can get all the details there. But what's most remarkable is that Bob Rucker's hypothesis has actually been scientifically and independently confirmed in the published peer-reviewed scientific literature, namely by Dr. Thomas McAvoy and his ultraviolet fluorescence studies in the journal Applied Optics. Incredible. Let's take a look at that and what Tom McAvoy found out.
Fluorescence intensity is higher on the dorsal image than the frontal. And this means you compare feet to feet, and then, maybe the knee to the knee, and torso to the torso, etc. And then the fluorescence intensity is higher on the top side of the image than the bottom side of the image. And so the question I had after getting these results is, what could cause these unique fluorescence properties of the shroud itself? And I mentioned that Phillips had hypothesized that neutron radiation arising from the body covered by the shroud could, 1, alter its radiocarbon dating and create long-lived radioactive isotopes of chlorine and calcium in the shroud. It does not account for the image formation. Okay, and it's just a very brief, it's almost like one-page letter to the editor. I became familiar with, and I've actually interacted with Bob Rucker and what he did, and he published this in 2014 and is working on it, and has worked on it since. But he simulated neutron radiation. He actually simulated Phillips' hypothesis. And his main assumption is that, in the simulation, is that the thermal neutrons were emitted homogeneously, or uniformly, if you will, from within the body, and isotropically, or uniformly, in all directions. And the simulation then calculated radiocarbon dates for various points on the shroud. And he has here, there are 2 schematics I've taken from Bob's papers. One shows how the body in the shroud was laid out, the top one, and then the bottom one shows his model of the tomb. And you can see that to the right of the body, there's a wall. To the left, there's empty space. And he had this code that I believe he had worked on when he was at the lab out in Washington, that he used for his simulations. And he ran a bunch of Monte Carlo simulations. And here's what he got in terms of his radiocarbon dating. And this is now down the center. He had results down the whole shroud. I'm just showing the center image here. And if you look at the circle, you can see that comes from the area of the shroud that is actually radiocarbon dated. And you can see there's a pretty significant gradient there. And we saw when we looked at the numbers, it was about 90 years per inch. So there's a pretty steep gradient over there. And as you get closer to the center of the shroud, then it becomes younger and younger and younger. And eventually you wind up having it date to the future. But these are his results. And the x-axis or the y-axis here are the radiocarbon dates that he's calculating. When I plot my UV results, and again, the UV are results from the shroud, I was amazed. I got the same type of curve or plot. You can see that there's a double maximum. The dorsal image or the back image is on the left in both cases, and the frontal image is on the right. The biggest maximum occurs in the dorsal image, and it occurs right around the torso area of the body. And the frontal image, the same thing. The maximum occurs around the torso area of the body. But to me, these were pretty amazing. I mean, this is like saying I've got an orange and I've got an apple, and somehow the orange looks like the apple or the apple looks like the orange.
Okay, so that is incredible confirmation of the neutron irradiation hypothesis for the Shroud of Turin. And finally, one last thing on this carbon-14 dating. Don't forget my own personal argument. James may not be aware of this, but I argue that the dating of the shroud is totally irrelevant. Let's pretend it is a medieval shroud. I can still prove, based on the scientific evidence, the physical and chemical properties of the image formation, body and blood stain images, that they are miraculous shroud images. If they're miraculous, supernatural, miraculous shroud images attesting to Jesus' death and implying his resurrection, that's good enough to be a religion authenticating miracle for the truth of Christianity. It doesn't matter whether the shroud is actually the burial shroud that touched the historical Jesus or not. Who cares? Maybe it's some medieval cloth used for the Quem Queritas ritual, as shroud skeptic Hugh Ferry likes to posit. But the images were miraculously produced by God as proof for the truth of Christianity, albeit in the medieval period, not in the first century during the time of Jesus' resurrection itself. I mean, look, as Christians, we believe in miracles that take place today in the year 2025, miraculous healings proving Christianity, exorcism, stuff like that. Nobody bats an eye and says, well, because it didn't date to the time of Jesus, it can't be a real miracle or proof for the truth of Christianity. No, God could do a miracle proving Christianity was true in the medieval period, just like he could do in the first century. Again, that's just in a worst case scenario. I believe the shroud did indeed was the burial shroud covering the historical Jesus in 30 AD, and the images were formed through a supernatural radiation burst at the moment of Jesus' resurrection. That's what the evidence indicates. But even if the evidence proved the shroud was medieval, that does not logically entail that the images are not miraculous proof for Christianity. And that's my point about the irrelevance of the dating of the Shroud of Turin. All right, let's move on to the next. Before we do with carbon-14, you also cite Doug Donahue. There are problems with Doug Donahue and kind of some incompetence on his part as a carbon-14 scientist with respect to the Shroud of Turin. There were certain suspicions. So in February of 1989, around mid-February, Harry Gov called Doug Donahue to say that he heard the official report would be in the February 16th issue of Nature. Donahue confirmed this and also said that that issue would have a letter from Thomas J. Phillips, the one I told you about, the neutron irradiation from Harvard, and the Fermilab, hypothesizing that the resurrection of Jesus could have produced neutrons and an excess of carbon-14. The Tucson Press contacted Doug Donahue about the letter, and he told Gov it was the first time he had used expletives. Gov added he was indignant that Nature would publish such a letter. In other words, he was horribly biased against a traditional Christianity which believes in a supernatural resurrection and would argue so on the basis of the Shroud of Turin. He was biased against that, and that counts against Doug. I don't trust that guy. His science is clearly skewed by his bias, and when we find out that he and his colleagues fudged the data back in 1989 to get the results they wanted in disproving the Shroud, and has now been totally discredited by 6 peer-reviewed secular science journals, including Archeological, Oxford University Lab's own journal. This is very troubling, let's say. And this comes, look, from the biased carbon-14 guy himself, Harry Gov, the atheist who hated the Shroud and Christians and was the guy who invented AMS carbon-14 dating. He's the source for this, cutting up Donahue without realizing it. It's crazy because Doug Donahue is a Catholic. He's not an atheist. So why on earth would he have a problem with the hypothesis of Thomas Phillips, who is obviously affiliated with 2 of the most prestigious institutions in the U.S., right? Harvard and I forget what the other one was. It just means, look, if Donahue's findings were solid, he should have nothing to fear from what Thomas Phillips argued. But it looks like Donahue was worried this opens the door for a supernatural miracle and for our Shroud skeptical stance to be wrong, and he didn't like it. So that's troubling. Another thing is troubling is how he was incompetent as a scientist, carbon-14 scientist, in handling his samples. So in 1990, there was an investigation because the credible scientists found out that there was apparently 2 pieces of the sample at Arizona, and they wanted to resolve this issue. What happened? How did this happen? How did Arizona get 2 separate samples? So on October 26th, Brother Bruno, following up on Timothy Jull's reply, went to Arizona and he asked Donahue about this. And Doug Donahue said, quote unquote, all right, I don't know. I think we received, I think, but I'm not sure that we received 2 pieces, 2 fragments, but I have no record of that. It's only my memory. Very sketchy, very, very sketchy. But Arizona Labs itself reported that it was Doug Donahue who had cut the sample into 4 pieces before giving them to Tulin, the team chemist, for cleaning. Interesting. Is this a cover-up on Doug Donahue's part? What's going on here? They sum up their investigation from the University of Arizona as follows. If we weigh up the conversations at Tucson, we are bound to conclude that the testimonies of Doug Donahue and of his assistant Jull, on the one hand, and of Paul Damon on the other, they are absolutely contradictory. Somebody is lying. Why would a scientist lie? On the one side, no records and no photographs, according to Doug Donahue. But on the other, no, there's photographs and there's even a TV record. What's more, in 1991, Doug Donahue came to a conference at Columbia University. And there, Doug Donahue tells the attendees that the sample received by his lab was in 2 pieces, one weighing 14 milligrams and the other 40 milligrams. But the weights given there don't match what Brother Bruno had noted down in his own notebook when he observed during this investigation. So there's another contradiction there. So yeah, Doug Donahue, he gives a smart aleck little comment like, oh, I bet those Shroud of Turin guys would have loved to get a result like that. But he's been exposed as an incompetent carbon-14 scientist and very, very biased against Christians and the resurrection, and even supposing for a second that the Shroud of Turin was 1st century. Again, there's that suspicion because how does he know it's a shroud? How does he know if it was blind, how does he know to compare the sample you gave him to the Shroud of Turin? This is very troubling. It looks like a conspiracy. I'm not saying there is. And obviously, James, you're an eyewitness. So, if you want to speak to this and let me know, I'll write to me either by email or come on the show just to clarify this. I'm happy to post that up for my audience to consider. because otherwise it looks like Doug Donahue is up to some shenanigans here. All right, next up, we have the next argument. The shroud is a 14th century artistic production, according to James Tabor. All right, so James is convinced that the shroud is a 14th century art production, quote unquote production, based on the shroud skeptic, Professor Nicholas Allen. He says, as per Allen, that there was a shift in realistic art, known as the artistic humanism phase, in the 13th and 14th centuries AD, during the age of humanism. And it was at this time that the Shroud of Turin was created artistically in the same line as the Man of Sorrows iconography of the Byzantine and Roman Catholic empires during the medieval period. So here's James, followed by Professor Nicholas Allen, talking about this age of humanism for art and how the Shroud of Turin fits into this realistic Man of Sorrows depiction of Jesus.
I'm convinced that the Shroud of Turin is a 14th century production. I was so impressed. I saw it on your channel. You've got to put that link in for everybody. Everybody needs to watch this. It doesn't have enough views. There are videos out there now that were made in the last month or two, but particularly since April, that have millions of views, and they're spreading false information. They are largely from the evangelical Christian side of things, apologists, people that I know well, such as Craig Evans, Scott Stripling, Dr. Jeremiah Johnson, not the preacher, but the scholar, Gary Habermas. You can Google YouTube and find these things that are making outright definitive statements that the Shroud of Turin is the burial cloth of Jesus and therefore proves the resurrection, and there's no other explanation. Well, Nicholas Allen explained everything as far as I could tell. Now, I'm not an expert on the shroud. You know, they even have a name for shroud studies. But I've read a lot about it. I've been studying the Shroud of Turin since 1970. That's when it first came to my attention in graduate school. I've read everything I could get on it over the years. I followed the discussions. I never thought I would be involved in testing a burial shroud, a real burial shroud from Jerusalem from the first century. I don't necessarily like the word fraud. I prefer religious relic. Now, you say, well, what's the difference? I don't know why it was made. And I think Dr. Allen might agree with this. I think he might have, I can't remember if he said something along these lines. But he does show the art history of the time, which is the key. He has two main points in the video. You need to understand how art shifted dramatically in the 12 and 1300s to portraying Jesus as brutally and bloodily beaten to death and crucified. It's part of the art. Before that time, the realism wasn't there. We've all seen the art. Little pristine blood spot on the foot, maybe a drip. The hands, just a little red spot. And those were devotional. People would go in and look at the paintings, the statues. They would meditate on the sufferings of Jesus, Stations of the Cross, and so on. But there's a huge shift, as he shows in the art. And suddenly you're not dealing with that kind of image of Jesus. You're beginning to get a sense of real agony, a sense of realism. And I think it's the spirit of the times.
Okay, so that is James Tabor. And in terms of how it was made, we're going to save that for part 2, right? Because Nicholas Allen has the proto-photo hypothesis. And this is, as I've evaluated in previous shows, an utter failure. It cannot and does not explain the totality of all the physical and chemical properties of the shroud's bloodstains, nor does it explain the shroud's body images adequately and sufficiently based on the minimal relevant features proven scientifically in the peer-reviewed science journals by Sturt. But I'm going to save my assessment of that for next time in part 2. For this, I want to finish off with this first claim that James is borrowing from Allen, that there was this radical shift with the Man of Sorrows icon and stuff like that, supposedly, and the Shroud of Turin is just one of these artistic representations in that vein. So let's see what Professor Dr. Nicholas Allen himself has to say in this quick 6-minute clip. This is the video that James Tabor is talking about from the History Valley podcast.
So when you start seeing some of the art of the end of this, what I would call the Italo-Byzantine period, you'll notice that the old art is two-dimensional, it's flat. This Jesus, for example, on the cross, has his eyes wide open because you were not allowed to show Jesus dead. Very important. You'll also notice that he has 4 nails, 1 in each hand and 1 in each foot. And he doesn't look like he's really suffering. He's just kind of standing around waiting for better times. You'll also notice that the blood on the wounds is very understated. In fact, images before this, they were not even the size of mosquito bites, all right? So now we see blood is becoming a little bit more important because they want the audience to empathize with what's happening. They want them to be part of this and associate with what's happening. And as humanism grows, now we're moving into the middle of the 13th century after the time of Francis of Assisi. And now we start seeing still relatively flat images, but the Christ is now writhing. He's twisting in pain. And there's a lot more blood coming out of the wounds. And in the sides, you can see John the Divine and Mary weeping, showing humanity, showing sympathy for what's happening. And if we move on quickly to a work by Cimabue, we see that now it's pretty much the same, the writhing Christ, but now the blood is really flowing, and we still have the weeping figures. And then when we get to the work of Duccio, we see now that the figure is hanging in a space, that he only has 3 nails now, not 4, because now they want to empathize the Trinity. So 3 nails is a better figure because there are 3 persons in God. And the blood is really flowing. In fact, the blood is flowing so much that it's spraying out of the side of his body and dripping down the cross. As we go into the 15th century, this need to emphasize the suffering of Christ and what he did for you as a human being is emphasized more and more. There's not only paintings, there's also play productions, poetry. It's a big deal now. Christ is held up as this pitiful creature, if you like, who did all these things for you. He suffered for you. So in this painting, you can see, which is done in the international style, you see that the nails are still in the wood, meaning that his hands were ripped off those nails to make you feel the pain. He very carefully holds the whip in his left hand with which he was scourged. An angel hands him a birch, which he might have been whipped by. He has a crown of thorns, and he is showing you the wound in his side, very, very artistically. This image, which is post the shroud, belonged to the Duc de Berry, and the Duc de Berry owned the shroud, which I will talk about a little bit later. And because he owned the shroud, the artists who portrayed these images of Christ in this important book called Très Riche de Duc de Berry used the shroud as the model for the images of Christ. And you can see that this Christ here is bleeding profusely. Blood is dripping down his legs, down his forearms, and the blood from his side is really making a mess. And here's another scene from Les Très Riches de Duc de Berry by Jean Collomb. And it is obviously referring to the shroud. Of course, it wasn't called the Shroud of Turin at this time. It was probably the Shroud of Chambéry. And you can see clearly that Christ is lying on the cloth, and the wounds match those that we saw on the cloth. Another image from the Shroud de Duc de Berry, where the image of Christ as a man of sorrows who has risen from the grave is shown sporting the exact same wounds that are on the shroud. And just to really emphasize, these are typical images from the period, emphasizing the suffering of Christ and what he did for humanity.
Okay, so that was Nicholas Allen and James copying Nicholas Allen's artistic theory, proving that the shroud is a 14th century artistic production. Now, unfortunately, things are a little more complicated than Nicholas Allen was making it seem. The Man of Sorrows image developed from the Byzantine epitaphios image, which possibly dates back to the 8th century, 700s AD. And essentially, there was a miraculous Byzantine mosaic icon known as the Imago Pietatis or the Christ of Pity. That's what it was called. And the work appears to have been brought to the major pilgrimage church of Santa Croce in Gerusalemme in Rome in the 12th century AD. By the 13th century, it was becoming common in the West as a devotional image for contemplation in sculpture, painting, and manuscripts. And again, in the 13th century, is also full-length figures also first appear in southern Germany in wall paintings and sculpture beginning in the 14th century. And this continued to grow in popularity until the Jubilee year of 1350. Around the same time the Shroud of Turin was exhibited publicly in Liry, France. So there are these correlations, and I think most pro-shroud experts recognize this too. But again, Allen's presentation is too overly simplistic, because really these things are motivated by the Shroud of Turin. The paintings are copying the shroud's not copying the paintings and the artistic trends. And we can prove that through the art history argument, which traces the shroud back to the 6th century AD. And the documentary evidence of pro-shroud historian Jack Marquardt, for example, goes meticulously every document, every image, including numismatic coins and artistic images. And I think my friend Guy Powell has also done a lot of research on the art history argument, proving the Shroud of Turin was the basis for artistic representations of Jesus, going all the way back to the 6th century, the 500s AD. Here's a medieval art historian and world's expert on the Man of Sorrows iconography, for example, Dr. or Professor Alexei Lidov. And he's been on my friend Guy Powell's show on the backstory on the Shroud. But here's a short little clip talking about his research as the Shroud inspiring the Man of Sorrows icon from the famous 2010 BBC documentary.
Professor Lidov believes a memory of the image on the shroud was preserved in the art of the period. This icon of Christ is known as the Man of Sorrows. It became popular in Constantinople when the shroud disappeared. It has many of the distinctive features of the image on the Shroud of Turin, the crossed arms, the hidden thumb. And significantly, it depicts an image of Christ emerging out of a box-like tomb, as if raised up from the dead. Many different versions of it exist. It was clearly a celebration of the resurrection of Jesus, and almost certainly invokes the ritual involving a shroud described by the Crusader Robert de Clary. I wonder if its origin might be connected with the loss of the shroud in some way.
I think so. In a way, we may consider this as a kind of compensation of this great loss and the commemoration of the presence of the shroud in Constantinople.
The Pray manuscript, the testimony of Robert de Clary, and the Man of Sorrows icon all build a compelling case for the Shroud of Turin being older than the date specified by the carbon-14 test.
So there you have it. The world's experts are saying, actually, the Man of Sorrows icon, contrary to Nicholas Allen, it was the Shroud of Turin that existed prior to that, proven through historians like Jack Marquardt, pro-shroud historians, and their research, scholarly research proving that. But it was the shroud that inspired the Man of Sorrows icon. Namely, it was a coping mechanism for the Byzantines in Constantinople to deal with the loss of the Shroud of Turin during or shortly after the sack of Constantinople in 1204. Robert de Clary talks about the Shroud of Turin in 1203, just before the French Crusaders sacked the city and took all their relics, and the Latin emperors took control and eventually took it to France. And the Man of Sorrows icon was a coping mechanism of the Byzantines to say, oh no, we've lost the Holy Shroud. All right, let's make this Man of Sorrows icon to look just like the Shroud Man, to compensate for that loss of this important relic of the burial shroud of Christ. That's what the art historian experts have to say, in contradiction to Nicholas Allen there. So it's just not true. There's no provable way to say, well, is this Man of Sorrows icon based on the new Shroud of Turin? Because think about it. 1204, we have the Crusades, and that's when it starts, 13th century, that's when it starts becoming popular in Europe, just when the shroud is transferred to Europe, from Constantinople to Europe by the Crusaders and the Latin emperor, Baldwin II, in the 1260s. Perfect fit. They're seeing the Shroud of Turin, and the art corresponds. This is the authoritative image. Therefore, we're going to make artistic images copying it, just as Nicholas Allen says was happening, right? He said some of these artistic works from the 1400s, the 15th century, are known to be copies of the shroud, because the shroud is the authoritative image. So that's very interesting. Maybe, as the pro-shroud people, historians have proven and shown, all of these images are copies on the shroud, or copies of copies based on the Shroud of Turin. It's the Shroud of Turin that's serving as the authoritative image and spurring on the humanist or realism element within art as it becomes known to the Europeans in the 13th century, as well as the Byzantines, when it's actually being shown according to pro-shroud historians. And again, there are two different historical theories. I go for Jack Marquardt's hypothesis, and I think that matches up with the Man of Sorrows iconography in the Byzantine Empire, as well as within Europe. And again, James Tabor gets the Veil of Veronica wrong. I think this is part of the image of Edessa, and it's a confusion of the legend of the image of Edessa, which really flourishes in the 10th century, around 945 AD, once the image of Edessa is transferred from Edessa to Constantinople. So there are equally probable, if not more probable, alternative historical hypotheses offered by pro-shroud historians in exquisite detail, and they go way beyond anything Nicholas Allen was presenting here with the Man of Sorrows icon. So yeah, I'm just going to keep it simple and say, check out some of my shows. Now, Jack Marquardt, he is about to do a show in August covering the period from 1001 to 1204 AD. Then we're going to cover the middle period from 1205 up to the 1350s. And then we're going to cover the medieval period, 1350 up to the 1400s, and cover all of the evidence there. So you're going to want to tune in if you're interested in the medieval period and what's going on with the Man of Sorrows icons. Check out those upcoming Shroud War panel review shows. If you're interested in the earlier periods, those shows are already up. Just search Real Seekers panel review Jack Marquardt, and you'll see I cover from 30 AD to 500 AD. Then we do another show covering from 501 to 900 AD. And we just did a third show from 901 to 1000 AD. And that is extremely thorough, covers all of the evidence relevant to proving the shroud is the basis, authoritative basis for all of these artistic images within the Byzantine Empire and later on within the Roman Catholic Church in Europe. Just as Allen himself freely admits, when it comes to the Renaissance period in the 1400s, he has no problem, or late 1300s. You go, yep, this is copied from the shroud. This is and I did. There was something interesting that I learned new from Nicholas Allen, but I'm going to save that for next time, even though it's not related to image formation. But he talks about how the Pilgrim's Medallion from the 1350s represents the blood belt as a chain. I had never heard that on the Pilgrim's Medallion. So that was something cool. And I'll play the clip next time on that. And he also mentions there was the stone, which also depicted the Shroud of Turin from the 1300s that I'd never heard of. So Nicholas Allen did genuinely present some new bits of data that I was unaware of, at least from the medieval period. So I liked those two things. But again, it changes nothing. Pro-Shroud proponents and historians have always said, yeah, the Shroud of Turin was in Liry, France, and was being exhibited. That this is known. There's nothing controversial here. It's just a matter of, can you prove that it originated in the 14th century in France? And the answer is no. The Shroud skeptics can't prove that. And on the other side, the pro-Shroud historians have evidence proving the Shroud dates back centuries prior to the 14th century. And like I said, the dates align perfectly with the Sitz im Leben, the life situation of what's going on, and how the origin of the Man of Sorrows results based on the Shroud of Turin's images. It all fits perfectly from a historical perspective. And again, you can check out, I have some shows actually already up on the medieval period with Jack Markwart, the pro-Shroud historian, versus Hugh Ferry, and then another one, Answering Shroud Skeptics, where he covers the medieval history again in exquisite detail, including linking the carbon-14 dates, which totally rule out something that James didn't realize. The Shroud, the carbon-14 dates only really allow for 5 years during which the Shroud could have been made, between 1315 and 1320 or something like that. Select dates in and around that range. So yeah, the Shroud could not have been invented around 1350. And one thing I just want to say for this thing, the last thing I'll say is, look, everyone with a PhD, medieval art historians, do not agree with Nicholas Allen's take here about the Shroud and the Man of Sorrows icon. In fact, they say the opposite. The Shroud is totally unique and has nothing, and is not a part of any medieval artistic technique that is known, painting or otherwise, proto-photo or nothing. Nothing compares to the Shroud of Turin. And if it just doesn't fit how they were depicting Jesus in the 14th century, it's not even conceived as any kind of artistic thing that someone would think up. Again, under the proto-photo hypothesis, somebody would need to create a statue of Jesus in this image, according to this Man of Sorrows icon, and in this known way. But unfortunately, the Shroud of Turin, it doesn't correspond to any known artistic fads or anything like that. And here, if you don't believe me, here's medieval art historian, PhD doctor, non-religious and a non-religious agnostic, Dr. Thomas de Westlow. But I played him a lot lately, so I'm just going to play a 30-second clip of him proving my point.
So you didn't need to forge the perfect forgery in the Middle Ages. People were gullible in those days, especially when it came to religious relics. In short, the idea that the Shroud is a medieval work of art is simply untenable. It doesn't look like a medieval work of art, it's not made like one, and it's certainly not conceived like one. And that's why art historians like me, or not like me actually, have completely ignored the Shroud of Turin over the course of the last century. It just doesn't fit into the history of art.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas de Westlow, non-religious agnostic, medieval art historian, says Nicholas Allen is wrong. The Shroud images do not fit into any medieval artistic technique or images known from the 14th century, and Dr. Thomas de Westlow has an actual PhD in this field, and he knows what he's talking about. So yeah, I hope that was helpful for you, James. That's it for today. Episode 1 and episode 2, or part 2 of the Tomb Shroud versus Turin Shroud, I will get into more details about Nicholas Allen's scientific hypothesis, how the body images were formed by the proto-photo hypothesis, and talk about the formation of the bloodstains as well a little bit. So look out for that next time. Yeah, take care. And I hope it was helpful. James and Nicholas Allen, you guys, as you know, have been very friendly and respectful to me. And I respect the heck out of you guys as scholars and as people that are open-minded in presenting your ideas, giving your best shot as to what you think the truth is. So just understand both of you have an open invitation on my show to come on my show anytime. And hey, I would love to schedule some discussion shows or debates, where you're kind of discussing with other experts who take a different view. I think that would really, really be great. So yeah, just you guys have an open invitation to use or not use as you see fit. All right. God bless and take care, everyone.